Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of England's most fascinating yet forgotten rulers, Penda of Mercia, the last great pagan warrior king of Anglo-Saxon England. From around 626 to 655, Penda stood as a defiant figure against the rising tide of Christianity, wielding sword and shield in defense of the ancient gods, while the world around him transformed. His story unfolds during England's most tumultuous era, when kingdoms rose and fell like morning mist, and faith became the ultimate weapon of politics. We'll softly explore how this remarkable ruler built Mercia into England's most formidable kingdom, defeated two mighty Northumbrian kings, who would later become saints, and maintained his pagan beliefs even as Christian missionaries swept across the land. From his mysterious rise to power through his legendary victories at Hatfield Chase and Maserfield, to his final stand at the Winwaed, all while the gentle rhythms of 7th century England lull you toward restful sleep. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear your thoughts about tonight's story. Perhaps you could share in the comments which aspect of Penda's tale intrigues you most: his military genius, his religious convictions, or maybe his complex relationships with both pagan and Christian allies. Your gentle words always bring such joy to our growing Sleepy Crown family. And if you find comfort in these soothing historical tales, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep these tranquil stories flowing your way. So settle deeply into your covers, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 7th century England carry you into the most peaceful sleep. Welcome to our cozy circle of dreamers, where history's greatest stories await your slumbering mind. Penda, later known as the King of Mercia and the last great pagan ruler of Anglo-Saxon England, emerged from the mists of the early 7th century like a figure from ancient legend. Born around the year 606 into a world where the old gods still held sway over vast stretches of Britain, he would grow to become the most formidable warrior king of his age, a man whose very name would send tremors through the hearts of Christian monarchs across the land. In those distant days, when morning mist still clung to the Thames and wolves still roamed the forests of what would become England, the island was divided among several great kingdoms. Northumbria stretched across the wild northern reaches. Wessex claimed the rolling hills of the south and west. East Anglia ruled the eastern marshlands, and in the heart of England lay Mercia, a realm that would soon rise to unprecedented power under Penda's iron will. The world into which Penda was born was one of profound transformation. Christianity, brought first by Roman missionaries and later by Irish monks, was slowly but steadily spreading across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Kings who had once made sacrifices to Woden and Thor were now accepting baptism in wooden churches, trading their sacred arm rings for Christian crosses. Yet in Mercia, the ancient ways persisted with stubborn strength. Penda's father, Pibba, ruled over a kingdom that remained steadfastly pagan, where warriors still swore oaths by the old gods, and where the rhythms of the seasons were marked by festivals that stretched back to the misty origins of the Germanic peoples. The royal genealogies claimed descent from Woden himself, through a line of legendary kings, including Ixel, the founder of the Eklingis dynasty, and the mythical Offa of Angel, whose fame was sung in halls across the Germanic world. As a young prince growing up in this pagan stronghold, Penda would have been raised on the ancient stories, tales of heroes and gods, of great battles and noble sacrifices, of honor won through deeds of valor and wisdom gained through suffering. He would have learned to fight with sword and spear, to lead men in battle, and to make the hard decisions that kingship demanded. But above all, he would have learned the sacred duties that bound a king to his people and his gods. The political landscape of early 7th century England was one of constant flux, where alliances shifted like shadows, and where a kingdom's survival often depended on the skill and courage of his ruler. When Penda came of age, Northumbria under King Edwin had emerged as the dominant power, its influence stretching far beyond its traditional borders to encompass much of what is now England. Edwin himself had achieved the coveted position of Bredwalda, the wide ruler whose authority was acknowledged by the lesser kings of the southern kingdoms. But Edwin's power rested on more than military might alone. In 627, he had accepted baptism at the hands of Paulinus, the Roman missionary, making Christianity not merely a personal faith, but a tool of statecraft. Christian kings, Edwin discovered, could call upon the support of the powerful Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, could claim the backing of Rome itself, and could present themselves as the representatives of a higher, more civilized order than the old pagan ways. It was into this world of shifting loyalties and competing faiths that Penda would step as a young man, inheriting a kingdom that stood as one of the last bastions of the ancient Germanic traditions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the centuries, between the old gods and the new, between the warrior culture of the pagan past and the emerging Christian future, between the stubborn defiance of tradition and the irresistible tide of change. Yet Penda's story is not simply one of religious conflict, though faith would play a central role in his reign. It is the tale of a man who combined genuine devotion to his ancestral beliefs with shrewd political calculation, who could ally with Christian kings when it served his purposes while never wavering in his own pagan convictions. He was a ruler who understood that in the dangerous game of 7th century politics, flexibility was often more valuable than rigid principle, except when it came to the gods of his fathers. The Mercia that Penda would inherit was not yet the mighty kingdom it would become under his rule. Centered in the valley of the River Trent, with its royal seat at Tamworth, it controlled the vital crossroads of central England, but lacked the resources and prestige of the great coastal kingdoms. The Mercians themselves were a people of mixed origins, Angles who had migrated from the continental homeland generations before, British Celts who had been absorbed into the expanding kingdom, and smaller tribal groups who had accepted Mercian overlordship. What Mercia possessed, however, was strategic position and the fierce loyalty of its people to their pagan traditions. Unlike the coastal kingdoms, which had been more exposed to Roman influence and Christian missions, the inland realm had remained largely untouched by the new faith. Here, the sacred groves still stood inviolate, the old festivals were still observed with ancient ritual, and the warrior bands still gathered in the timber halls to hear the deeds of their ancestors sung to the music of harp and horn. As Penda grew to manhood, he would have witnessed the gradual transformation of the world around him. Christian missionaries moved through the land like harbingers of a new age, establishing churches and monasteries, converting nobles and commoners alike. Kings, who had once prided themselves on their descent from the gods, now traced their legitimacy to divine appointment by the Christian deity. The very language of politics was changing, as terms like grace of God and divine providence replaced the older concepts of fate and word. Yet for all the changes swirling around Mercia, the kingdom itself remained a refuge for the old ways. Here, warriors still decorated their war gear with the symbols of the ancient gods, still swore their most sacred oaths on rings blessed by pagan priests, still believed that courage in battle and loyalty to one's lord were the highest virtues a man could possess. It was this world, this last flowering of pagan Anglo-Saxon culture, that would shape Penda's character and define his reign. The young prince, who would one day become the most feared warrior king in England, was thus the product of two worlds, the ancient Germanic culture of his ancestors and the rapidly changing political landscape of 7th century Britain. From his pagan heritage, he inherited not only religious beliefs, but an entire worldview that emphasized personal courage, loyalty to kin and lord, and the sacred nature of the bond between ruler and ruled. From the political realities of his time, he learned the arts of diplomacy and alliance, the importance of military innovation, and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances while holding fast to essential principles. These formative influences would make Penda a unique figure in early English history, a man who could negotiate with Christian kings while never abandoning his pagan faith, who could adopt new military techniques while maintaining the warrior ethos of his ancestors, who could play the complex game of 7th century politics while remaining true to the values that had made him king. He would become, in the words of one modern historian, the last great representative of the heroic age of Anglo-Saxon England. But all of that lay in the future as the young Penda grew to maturity in the halls of Tamworth, learning the skills that would one day make him the most formidable ruler of his age. The old gods watched over his development, preparing their chosen champion for the battles that would define not only his own fate, but the future of pagan England itself. When Penda ascended to the throne of Mercia, sometime around 626, he inherited far more than a kingdom. He received the accumulated dreams, traditions, and sacred obligations of a people who traced their origins back to the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Germania. The crown that settled upon his brow carried with it the weight of generations, the blessings of the old gods, and the fierce expectations of warriors who had never bent the knee to any foreign faith. The Mercia of Penda's inheritance was a realm shaped by geography, tradition, and the relentless march of history. Stretching across the heart of what would one day become England, it occupied the crucial middle ground between the Celtic kingdoms of Wales and the Germanic settlements of the east coast. The kingdom's very name, derived from the Old English meres, meaning border folk, spoke to its position as a frontier realm, a place where different peoples and cultures met, mingled, and often clashed. At the center of this domain stood Tamworth, the royal stronghold that commanded the valleys of the Trent and the Tame. Here, in halls built of oak and ash, the kings of Mercia had held court for generations, dispensing justice, receiving tribute, and planning the campaigns that had slowly expanded their realm's borders. The fortress itself was a monument to Germanic tradition. Its great hall could accommodate hundreds of warriors. Its timber walls were decorated with shields and banners, and its very foundations seemed to pulse with the accumulated power of the Eclingus dynasty. The royal genealogy that legitimized Penda's rule was itself a tapestry woven from legend and history, reaching back through the generations to touch the realm of the divine. The line began with Woden, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, whose ravens flew across the battlefields of the world and whose wolves prowled the edges of human civilization. From this divine ancestor, the bloodline flowed through Wihtleg and Vermund, through Offa of Angel, that legendary king whose reputation for justice and valor had spread across the entire Germanic world, and down through Angltheo and Eomer to Eichel, the first of the line to set foot on British soil. This was no mere recitation of names, but a sacred litany that connected each Mercian king to the gods themselves. Every decision Penda made as ruler would be evaluated against the standards set by his divine and legendary ancestors. The weight of this inheritance was both burden and blessing. It granted him legitimacy that no earthly power could challenge, but it also demanded that he prove himself worthy of a bloodline that stretched back to the halls of Asgard itself. The kingdom Penda inherited was far from the mighty realm it would become under his rule. At the time of his accession, Mercia remained in the shadow of Northumbria's growing power, technically subject to King Edwin's overlordship and forced to pay tribute to the northern kingdom. This subordinate status grated against the proud traditions of the Mercian nobility, warriors who remembered when their own kings had been free to raid and conquer as they pleased, owing allegiance to no foreign lord. Yet within this apparent weakness lay the seeds of future strength. Mercia's central position gave it access to trade routes that connected the northern and southern kingdoms, while its inland location provided some protection from the Viking raids that would soon begin to plague the coastal realms. The kingdom's mixed population, Anglo-Saxon settlers, Romano-British survivors, and various smaller tribal groups, had been welded into a cohesive force by generations of Aeclingus rule and by their shared devotion to the old gods. The religious landscape of Penda's Mercia stood in stark contrast to the kingdoms around it. While Christian missionaries had made significant inroads into Northumbria, Wessex, and East Anglia, Mercia remained a bastion of traditional Germanic paganism. Here, the sacred groves still stood unmolested, their ancient oaks serving as living temples where priests conducted the rituals that had been handed down from the continental homeland. The seasonal festivals continued to mark the turning of the year. Yule, with its promise of returning light, Eostre, with its celebration of spring's renewal, Midsummer, with its fires that echoed the sun's power. The warrior culture that formed the backbone of Mercian society was inextricably linked to these religious traditions. The war bands that formed around prominent nobles were not merely military units, but sacred brotherhoods, bound together by oaths sworn before the gods and sealed with rituals that invoked divine protection. The weapons they carried, swords with names like Deathbringer and Shield Cleaver, were not mere tools of war, but sacred objects, blessed by priests and believed to carry the favor of the gods into battle. This fusion of religious belief and warrior culture created a society that was both deeply conservative and remarkably adaptable. Conservative in its adherence to the fundamental values of courage, loyalty, and honor that had sustained the Germanic peoples through centuries of migration and warfare. Adaptable in its ability to absorb new influences and adopt new tactics while maintaining its essential character. It was this combination that would make Penda such a formidable ruler. He could innovate and compromise when necessary, but he never forgot the core principles that made him a worthy successor to Woden and Offa. The political structure of Penda's Mercia reflected both Germanic tradition and the practical necessities of ruling a diverse population. At the apex stood the king himself, not as an absolute monarch but as the leader of leaders, bound by custom and obligation to his nobles, even as they owed him fealty and service. Below the king came the ealdormen, great nobles who ruled substantial territories in their own right, but who acknowledged Mercian overlordship. These were followed by the thegns, lesser nobles who formed the core of the royal warband, and finally by the ceorls, free farmers who owed military service but retained their own lands and rights. This hierarchy was held together, not by bureaucratic administration, but by the complex web of personal relationships that characterized Germanic society. Every bond between lord and follower was sealed by oaths and gift-giving, creating networks of obligation that extended throughout the kingdom. A king's generosity in distributing treasure and weapons was not merely political calculation but sacred duty. The gods themselves had made it clear that a niggardly lord would soon find himself without followers. The economic foundation that supported this warrior society was both simple and sophisticated. At its base lay agriculture, the grain fields and pastures that fed the population and provided the surplus that supported the royal court and its war bands. Trade routes carried luxury goods from distant lands, amber from the Baltic, silk from Byzantium, garnets from India. Skilled craftsmen produced the weapons, jewelry, and decorated objects that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The kingdom's position astride major river systems gave it access to trade networks that stretched across much of northern Europe. Yet for all its economic and military potential, the Mercia that Penda inherited remained an unrealized kingdom, its power constrained by the dominance of Northumbria and its influence limited by the rapid spread of Christianity among its neighbors. The young king who took the throne around 626 faced a fundamental choice. He could accept his kingdom's subordinate status and perhaps gain Edwin's favor by accepting baptism, or he could stand firm in his ancestral faith and risk everything in a bid for independence and power. The choice Penda made would define not only his own reign, but the future of pagan England itself. In choosing to remain true to the gods of his fathers, he set himself on a collision course with the greatest powers of his age. In deciding to break free from Northumbrian dominance, he embarked on a series of wars that would transform Mercia from a minor kingdom into the dominant force in Anglo-Saxon England, and in maintaining his pagan faith while the world around him converted to Christianity, he became both the last great champion of the old religion and a figure of fascination for all who came after. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable reigns in early English history. The gods had chosen their champion, the kingdom had found its destined ruler, and the age of Penda was about to begin. In the halls of Tamworth, warriors sharpened their swords and sang the old songs, while priests prepared the sacrifices that would invoke divine favor for the struggles ahead. The last great pagan king of England was ready to claim his destiny. As Penda consolidated his hold on the Mercian throne, he found himself ruling in an age of profound religious transformation. Across the breadth of Britain, the cross was rising above the ancient sacred groves, and kings who had once sacrificed to Woden and Thor were now kneeling before Christian altars. Yet in the heart of England, in the timber halls of Tamworth and the scattered settlements of the Mercian countryside, the old gods maintained their grip on the hearts and minds of a people who had never forgotten their ancestral faith. The challenge that Christianity posed to rulers like Penda was not merely theological, but intensely practical. Religion in the 7th century was inseparable from politics, and a king's choice of faith could determine the fate of his kingdom. Christian rulers could call upon the support of powerful allies, the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, the papal court in Rome, and increasingly, their fellow Christian kings within Britain itself. They could claim legitimacy not merely through ancient bloodlines, but through divine appointment, presenting themselves as God's chosen servants on earth. Yet Penda's response to this challenge revealed the complexity of his character and the sophistication of his political understanding. While he remained steadfastly committed to his ancestral faith, he did not allow religious differences to blind him to practical necessities. Throughout his reign, he would demonstrate a remarkable ability to work with Christian allies when it served his purposes, while never compromising his own religious convictions or forcing conversion upon his subjects. The King of Northumbria, Edwin, stood as the most visible symbol of Christianity's growing influence among the Anglo-Saxon rulers. His conversion in 627 had been a carefully orchestrated political event designed to strengthen his ties with the Frankish kingdoms and to present himself as the representative of a higher, more civilized order than the traditional Germanic paganism. The baptism itself, conducted by Paulinus in the Roman manner, had been followed by the systematic destruction of pagan temples and the establishment of Christian churches throughout Edwin's domains. From Penda's perspective, Edwin's conversion represented both threat and opportunity. The threat was obvious. A powerful Christian king could present himself as the champion of the new faith against the last bastions of paganism, potentially rallying other Christian rulers to his banner. But the opportunity was equally clear. Edwin's adoption of Christianity had alienated some of his own nobles and had created tensions with neighboring rulers who remained committed to the old ways. For a skilled politician like Penda, these divisions could be exploited. The religious landscape of 7th century Britain was far more complex than a simple division between Christian and pagan. Even among those kingdoms that had officially adopted Christianity, the new faith often sat uneasily alongside older traditions. Kings like Raedwald of East Anglia attempted to hedge their bets, maintaining Christian altars alongside pagan shrines and honoring both Christ and Woden as the situation demanded. Others found themselves caught between Christian wives and pagan warbands, between missionary pressure and ancestral custom. This religious fluidity created opportunities for a ruler who could navigate between different faiths without betraying his own convictions. Penda proved masterful at this delicate balancing act. He could ally with Christian British kings against Christian Anglo-Saxon rulers, finding common ground in shared political interests rather than religious belief. He could marry his children to Christians while maintaining his own pagan practices. Most remarkably, he could allow Christian missionaries to preach within his own territories while never wavering in his devotion to the gods of his fathers. The theological differences between Christianity and Germanic paganism were profound, reflecting entirely different understandings of the divine, the natural world, and human destiny. The Christian God was presented as transcendent and universal, ruling over all creation from his heavenly throne, and demanding exclusive worship from his followers. The Germanic gods, by contrast, were seen as powerful, but not omnipotent, ruling over specific spheres of influence and expecting honor and sacrifice rather than exclusive devotion. These different religious worldviews shaped contrasting approaches to kingship and governance. Christian rulers were encouraged to see themselves as God's servants on earth, responsible for promoting the faith and governing according to divine law. Pagan kings like Penda understood their role in terms of the sacred bond between ruler and people, mediated by the gods but not dependent on their exclusive favor. Where Christian kingship emphasized humility before God and service to divine will, pagan kingship celebrated the heroic virtues of courage, wisdom, and generosity. Yet Penda's approach to religion was never simply reactionary or conservative. He understood that the changing religious landscape required careful navigation, and that absolute rigidity could lead to isolation and defeat. His policy toward Christianity within his own kingdom was remarkably tolerant for the age. He allowed Christian preaching and even permitted some of his own family members to convert, recognizing that faith was a matter of personal conviction rather than royal decree. This tolerance was not weakness but strength, reflecting Penda's confidence in his own beliefs and his understanding of the complex loyalties that bound his kingdom together. Many of his subjects, particularly in the borderlands with Christian kingdoms, had been exposed to the new faith and found it appealing. Rather than alienate these people through persecution, Penda chose to accommodate their beliefs while maintaining his own religious practices and ensuring that traditional Mercian values remained paramount. The king's personal devotion to the old gods was beyond question. Contemporary sources, even those written by Christian chroniclers hostile to his memory, acknowledged his genuine piety and his adherence to the religious practices of his ancestors. He continued to make the traditional sacrifices, to honor the sacred groves, and to seek divine guidance through the ancient rituals that had sustained Germanic rulers for generations. His court remained a center of pagan culture, where the old stories were told and the ancient songs were sung. This commitment to ancestral religion was more than personal preference. It was a deliberate political statement. By maintaining his pagan faith, Penda positioned himself as the champion of traditional Anglo-Saxon values against the foreign influence of Roman Christianity. He could appeal to those among his subjects and allies who saw conversion as betrayal of their ancestors, an abandonment of the values that had made the Germanic peoples great. The challenge of Christianity also forced Penda to articulate a coherent alternative vision of kingship and society. If Christian rulers claimed legitimacy through divine appointment and papal approval, pagan kings had to demonstrate their worthiness through more traditional means: military success, generous distribution of treasure, and adherence to the heroic values celebrated in Germanic culture. Penda rose to this challenge magnificently, proving through his victories and his governance that the old ways could still produce effective and legitimate rule. His response to the Christian challenge was thus multifaceted and sophisticated. On the personal level, he remained steadfastly committed to his ancestral faith, maintaining the religious practices that connected him to his divine ancestors and to the sacred traditions of his people. On the political level, he demonstrated that religious differences need not prevent cooperation between rulers who shared common interests. And on the cultural level, he preserved and promoted the values and traditions that defined Germanic civilization at its finest. The result was a reign that served as both the culmination and the swan song of pagan Anglo-Saxon culture. Under Penda's rule, Mercia became not only a military and political power, but a cultural beacon, attracting warriors and poets who valued the heroic traditions that were rapidly disappearing elsewhere. His court became a refuge for those who refused to abandon the faith of their fathers, even as it remained open to those who had chosen the path of conversion. This delicate balance could not last forever. The tide of Christian conversion was too strong, the political advantages of the new faith too compelling, for paganism to survive indefinitely as a viable alternative. But Penda's reign demonstrated that the old religion could adapt and endure far longer than his critics had expected, and that a skilled ruler could use religious diversity as a source of strength rather than weakness. The challenge of the cross had been met and answered, though the final resolution remained in the future. For now, in the halls of Tamworth and the sacred groves of Mercia, the old god still reigned supreme, protected by the swords of warriors who had not forgotten the ancient oaths. The stage was set for the great confrontations that would test the strength of both faiths and determine the religious future of England. In the shifting kaleidoscope of 7th century British politics, perhaps no alliance was more unlikely or more significant than the partnership between Penda of Mercia and Cadwallon ap Cadfan of Gwynedd. Here were two rulers from different peoples, different traditions, and different faiths, united by a common enemy and a shared determination to resist the growing power of Northumbria. Their collaboration would reshape the political landscape of Britain and demonstrate that the ancient enmities between Briton and Saxon could be set aside when necessity demanded. Cadwallon ruled Gwynedd from his fortress at Aberfrau, commanding the mountainous heart of Wales from shores that faced toward Ireland. His kingdom had ancient roots, claiming descent from the Romano-British nobility who had once governed these lands in the name of distant emperors. Unlike the pagan Angles and Saxons who had carved out kingdoms in the former Roman province, the Welsh had maintained their Christian faith through the dark centuries following the Roman withdrawal, developing a distinctive Celtic Christianity that owed little to continental influences. The very fact that these two rulers, one a pagan Anglo-Saxon king, the other a Christian British prince, could forge a working alliance speaks to the pragmatic nature of early medieval politics. Religious and ethnic differences, however profound, could be subordinated to the pressing demands of survival and ambition. Both Penda and Cadwallon faced the same overwhelming threat in Edwin of Northumbria, whose expanding power threatened to reduce all other rulers to vassalage. Edwin's threat to Welsh independence was particularly acute. The Northumbrian king had already demonstrated his willingness to launch devastating raids into Welsh territory, and his growing alliance with other Anglo-Saxon rulers suggested that a coordinated campaign of conquest might not be far distant. For Cadwallon, the choice was stark: submit to Northumbrian overlordship or find allies strong enough to help him resist Edwin's ambitions. Penda's position was equally precarious. As a vassal king under Edwin's overlordship, he chafed against the restrictions placed upon his independence while watching other Mercian nobles gradually succumb to the pressure to convert to Christianity. The traditional Mercian values of courage and independence seemed to be withering under the weight of Northumbrian dominance and Christian influence. Alliance with Cadwallon offered the possibility of breaking free from this subjugation, even if it meant working with a Christian British king. The practical negotiations that led to their alliance must have been complex and delicate. Here were representatives of peoples who had been enemies for generations, speaking different languages and following different religious traditions. Yet both rulers were sophisticated politicians who understood that effective cooperation required more than mere expediency. They needed to find common ground that could sustain their partnership through the inevitable strains of a long campaign. Part of that common ground lay in their shared warrior culture. Despite the ethnic and religious differences between Britons and Anglo-Saxons, both peoples had maintained the heroic traditions that celebrated courage, loyalty, and martial prowess. Cadwallon's court at Aberfraw, like Penda's hall at Tamworth, echoed with the songs of bards who praised the deeds of warriors and the wisdom of generous kings. Both rulers could appreciate and respect the military traditions of their ally, even while maintaining their own distinctive customs and beliefs. The religious dimension of their alliance was particularly fascinating. Cadwallon's Christianity was of the Celtic variety, quite different from the Roman Christianity that Edwin had adopted. Celtic Christianity placed greater emphasis on monastic traditions and maintained distinctive practices regarding everything from the calculation of Easter to the style of monastic tonsure. While Penda remained committed to his pagan faith, he could appreciate that Cadwallon's Christianity was at least authentically British, rather than a foreign import designed to serve political ends. Moreover, both rulers shared a common antipathy toward Edwin's particular brand of Christian kingship. The Northumbrian king's conversion had been closely tied to his political ambitions, and his subsequent actions suggested that he viewed Christianity primarily as a tool for consolidating and expanding his power. Neither Penda nor Cadwallon could respect this instrumentalist approach to religion. Regardless of their own theological differences, the military advantages of their alliance were considerable. Mercia's position in the heart of England gave Penda access to Edwin's territories and the ability to threaten Northumbrian communications. Cadwallon's Welsh strongholds provided secure bases from which to launch raids, and to which the allies could retreat if campaigns went badly. Together, they could force Edwin to fight on multiple fronts, dividing his attention and preventing him from concentrating his full strength against either ally. The planning for their joint campaign must have required extensive coordination. Armies had to be assembled, supply lines established, and invasion routes coordinated. The fact that they could achieve this level of cooperation despite the barriers of language, distance, and cultural difference testifies to the political skill of both rulers and to their genuine commitment to their common cause. Their alliance also sent a powerful message to other rulers throughout Britain. Here was proof that Edwin's dominance was not inevitable, that alternative coalitions were possible, and that resistance to Northumbrian hegemony could succeed. Other kings who had been contemplating submission to Edwin now had reason to reconsider their options, while those who had already acknowledged his overlordship might begin to question the wisdom of their choice. The cultural exchange that must have accompanied their military cooperation was equally significant. Penda's warriors would have had the opportunity to observe Welsh military techniques, particularly their skill in mountain warfare and their use of light cavalry. Cadwallon's forces, in turn, could learn from the disciplined infantry tactics that were the foundation of Anglo-Saxon military success. Both armies would have been strengthened by this mutual learning process. The personal relationship between the two kings remains tantalizingly obscure, hidden behind the formal language of chronicle accounts and the propaganda of later writers. Yet their successful cooperation suggests a genuine mutual respect that transcended the prejudices of their respective peoples. Both were warrior kings in the heroic tradition, rulers who led from the front and inspired their followers through personal example. Both understood the lonely burden of command and the terrible responsibility of making decisions that would determine the fate of their kingdoms. Their alliance also demonstrated the continuing relevance of the older political traditions that had shaped post-Roman Britain. The idea that ethnic and religious differences could be subordinated to political necessity was a legacy of the Roman imperial system, where diverse peoples had been united under common rule. Neither Penda nor Cadwallon was attempting to recreate the Roman Empire, but both understood that effective resistance to Edwin's hegemony required the same kind of pragmatic cooperation that had once characterized imperial administration. The implications of their partnership extended far beyond the immediate military campaign they were planning. If successful, their alliance could serve as a model for future cooperation between British and Anglo-Saxon rulers, potentially reshaping the entire political structure of post-Roman Britain. The rigid ethnic divisions that had characterized the immediate post-Roman period might give way to more flexible arrangements based on political interest rather than tribal identity. Yet the alliance also carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The fundamental differences between the two kingdoms in religion, culture, and long-term objectives meant that their partnership was likely to be temporary, lasting only as long as their common interest in defeating Edwin. Once that goal was achieved, other issues would inevitably drive them apart. For now, however, the alliance stood as a testament to the political creativity and pragmatic wisdom of both rulers. In an age of rigid ethnic and religious divisions, Penda and Cadwallon had found a way to transcend these barriers in service of their larger goals. Their partnership would soon be tested in the crucible of war, where the strength of their cooperation would determine not only their own fates, but the future balance of power throughout Britain. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in early English history. Two kings from different worlds had joined forces against the mightiest ruler of their age, betting everything on their ability to overthrow the established order and create new possibilities for their respective peoples. The gods of war, whether Woden or the Christian god, were about to render their judgment on this unlikely but determined alliance. The autumn of 633 dawned cold and grey across the flatlands of Yorkshire, where ancient Roman roads still carried travellers through a landscape that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. In this desolate region, where the Humber's muddy waters met the North Sea winds, the fate of Anglo-Saxon England was about to be decided. Here, at a place the chroniclers would remember as Hatfield Chase, three armies converged in a collision that would send shockwaves across the entire island. Edwin of Northumbria rode north from his capital at York with the confidence of a king who had never known defeat. For 17 years he had ruled as Bretwalda, the acknowledged overlord of the southern English kingdoms, his authority stretching from the Scottish borders to the English Channel. His conversion to Christianity had brought him powerful allies across the sea, while his military prowess had cowed potential enemies at home. Now, faced with rebellion from his vassal Penda and invasion from the Welsh, he moved to crush this challenge to his supremacy with the decisive force that had served him so well in the past. The king's army that marched toward battle was a formidable force, drawn from across the length and breadth of Northumbria. At its core stood the royal war band, elite warriors bound to Edwin by oaths of personal loyalty and equipped with the finest weapons that royal wealth could provide. These men had fought beside their king in a dozen campaigns, their shields bearing the scars of countless battles and their swords tasting victory in lands from the Forth to the Thames. Around this elite corps marched the levies of the great nobles, each contingent led by an ealdorman, whose own honour was bound up with his king's success. But Edwin's confidence may have blinded him to the changed circumstances he now faced. This was not another expedition against divided and poorly coordinated enemies, but a carefully planned assault by two of the most capable military leaders of the age. Penda and Cadwallon had spent months preparing for this moment, coordinating their forces and choosing their ground with the skill of masters of warfare. The battlefield would not be of Edwin's choosing, and the enemy he faced would prove far more dangerous than any he had previously encountered. The alliance forces had positioned themselves with considerable tactical skill, taking advantage of the broken ground around Hatfield Chase to nullify Edwin's numerical superiority. Cadwallon's Welsh warriors, masters of mountain warfare, had adapted their techniques to the marshy terrain, using their mobility and knowledge of the landscape to harass the Northumbrian advance. Penda's Mercians, disciplined infantry fighters in the Germanic tradition, formed the solid core of the Allied army, their shield wall technique honed through years of border warfare. The battle itself was fought with a savagery that shocked even an age accustomed to violence. Contemporary accounts, filtered through the religious prejudices of Christian chroniclers, describe a day of slaughter that left the field strewn with the bodies of nobles and common soldiers alike. Edwin's initial assault, delivered with the overwhelming force that had brought him victory in so many previous campaigns, crashed against the Allied line like waves against rocks. Yet this time, the enemy line held. Penda's warriors, fighting for the independence of their kingdom and the honour of their ancestral gods, stood firm against the Northumbrian charge. Their shields locked together in the wall formation that had served Germanic warriors since the days of Tacitus, while their spears thrust forward to create a bristling hedge of death. Behind them, Cadwallon's Welsh fighters waited for their moment, ready to exploit any weakness in the Northumbrian formation. The turning point came when Edwin himself entered the battle, leading a final desperate charge aimed at breaking the Allied centre. For a moment, it seemed that royal presence and personal courage might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The Northumbrian king, magnificent in his war gear and surrounded by his most loyal thegns, carved deep into the enemy ranks, his sword rising and falling with deadly precision. But the allies had prepared for this moment. As Edwin pressed forward, Cadwallon's reserve struck the Northumbrian flanks, rolling up the line while Penda's centre held firm against the royal assault. Caught between hammer and anvil, the Northumbrian army began to disintegrate. What had begun as an organised advance became a rout, as warriors who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. Edwin's death, when it came, marked the end of an era. The great king, who had dominated Anglo-Saxon politics for nearly 2 decades, fell surrounded by his enemies, his body hacked down by a dozen swords as his war band died around him. With him perished his son Oswald, cut down as he tried to defend his father, and many of the greatest nobles of Northumbria. The flower of a generation lay dead on the bloodied field. their shields and banners trampled into the autumn mud. The immediate aftermath of the battle was almost as significant as the fighting itself. Another of Edwin's sons, Edfrith, survived the slaughter, but fell into Penda's hands as a prisoner. This gave the Mercian king a valuable hostage and a potential tool for future political manipulation. The capture of royal prisoners was a common feature of early medieval warfare, but in this case, it would have lasting consequences, as Edfrith's fate would become entangled with the broader struggle between pagan and Christian kings. The psychological impact of Edwin's defeat reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Here was proof that the mighty could fall, that the seemingly invincible could be overcome by courage and skillful leadership. News of the victory spread rapidly across Britain, carried by travellers who had witnessed the battle or heard accounts from survivors. In kingdoms that had submitted to Edwin's overlordship, rulers began to reassess their options and reconsider their allegiances. For the Christian church in Northumbria, the defeat was catastrophic. Edwin's conversion had been presented as proof of Christianity's superiority over paganism, and his military success had been interpreted as divine favour for the new faith. Now, with the Christian king dead and his pagan enemies triumphant, the theological implications were deeply troubling. Some began to question whether the old gods had indeed been defeated, while others sought explanations that could preserve their faith in divine providence. The victory also had profound implications for the balance of power among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. With Northumbria's military might broken and its royal line shattered, other rulers began to assert their independence and pursue their own ambitions. The careful structure of overlordship that Edwin had built began to crumble, replaced by a more fluid and dangerous political situation, where alliances shifted constantly and warfare became endemic. Penda's role in the victory established him as a major force in Anglo-Saxon politics for the first time. No longer could he be dismissed as a minor vassal king or a barbarian chieftain, clinging to outmoded religious beliefs. He had proved himself on the greatest stage of all, defeating the most powerful ruler of his age through superior strategy and personal courage. The pagan king of Mercia had announced his arrival as a player in the highest levels of British politics. The immediate consequences of victory, however, also revealed the limitations of the Welsh-Mercian alliance. While Cadwallon pursued his own agenda in Northumbria, launching a campaign of destruction that would last for months, Penda appears to have withdrawn with his forces relatively quickly. The Allies had achieved their common goal of destroying Edwin's power, but they lacked a shared vision of what should replace it. Their divergent interests and different strategic priorities meant that their cooperation was unlikely to survive their mutual success. For Mercia itself, the victory brought both opportunities and challenges. The kingdom was now free from Northumbrian overlordship and could pursue its own expansionist policies without external constraint. Yet independence also brought responsibility. Penda would now need to defend his gains against inevitable counterattacks, while also managing the expectations of nobles and warriors who had shared in the glory of victory. The religious implications of the battle were equally complex. While later Christian chroniclers would present Hatfield Chase as a temporary setback in Christianity's inevitable triumph, contemporaries must have seen it as evidence that the old gods retained considerable power. Penda's victory had been won under the banners of Woden and Thor, blessed by the ancient rituals that his priests had performed before battle. For those who still honoured the traditional Germanic deities, this was proof that the ancestors remained strong and that conversion to Christianity was neither necessary nor wise. The battle's aftermath also demonstrated the continuing importance of warrior culture in determining political legitimacy. Edwin had claimed authority through Christian sanction and imperial precedent, but in the end, he had been judged by the ancient Germanic standard of success in battle. Penda's victory validated the traditional view that kingship belonged to those who could win and hold it through personal prowess and military skill. As the survivors of the Northumbrian army straggled home through the October darkness, carrying news of their king's death and their kingdom's humiliation, a new chapter in English history was beginning. The age of Edwin was over, and the age of Penda had begun. The last great pagan king of Anglo-Saxon England had served. Notice that the old ways were far from dead, and that the struggle between cross and the hammer had only just begun. In the halls of Tamworth, warriors feasted and poets sang of the great victory, while priests offered sacrifices of thanksgiving to the gods who had granted triumph to their faithful servants. The ancient traditions had been vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible, and their champion had emerged as one of the most powerful rulers in all of Britain. Yet even in the hour of triumph, thoughtful observers might have wondered how long such victories could continue, and whether the tide of history that favoured the cross could be held back indefinitely by courage and steel alone. In the wake of their stunning victory at Hatfield Chase, the unlikely alliance between Penda and Cadwallon had shattered the most powerful kingdom in 7th century Britain. Yet what followed the battle would prove even more significant than the fighting itself, as Cadwallon ap Cadfan embarked upon a campaign of such systematic destruction that it would haunt the collective memory of the English for generations to come. The autumn and winter of 633 became a season of terror across Northumbria, as the Welsh king revealed the depths of his hatred for the Saxon settlers who had displaced his people from their ancestral lands. Penda, having achieved his immediate objective of breaking free from Edwin's overlordship, appears to have withdrawn his forces relatively quickly after the battle. The Mercian king was a practical politician who understood that his interest lay in consolidating his gains rather than pursuing a campaign of conquest in distant Northumbria. His goal had been independence, not the destruction of an entire people. And with Edwin dead and the Northumbrian army scattered, that goal had been achieved. The time had come to return to Mercia and prepare for the inevitable attempts at revenge that would follow. Cadwallon's motivations were far more complex and personal. The Welsh king's war against Edwin had been more than a struggle for political independence. It had been a quest for vengeance that drew upon centuries of accumulated grievance between Briton and Saxon. His people had not forgotten the waves of Germanic invasion that had driven them from the rich lowlands into the mountain fastnesses of Wales, nor had they forgiven the destruction of Romano-British civilization that had followed the Saxon conquest. In Cadwallon's mind, the time for retribution had finally come. The campaign that followed Edwin's death was unlike anything seen in Britain since the darkest days of the Saxon invasions 2 centuries earlier. Cadwallon's forces, freed from the restraints of their Mercian allies and driven by their king's implacable hatred, spread across Northumbria like a plague. No settlement was too small to escape their attention, no church too sacred to avoid destruction. The systematic nature of the devastation suggests careful planning and a deliberate policy of terror designed to break the will of the Northumbrian people. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through the religious prejudices of later Christian chroniclers, provide glimpses of the horror that engulfed the northern kingdom. Bede, writing nearly a century later, but drawing upon the testimony of survivors, described a year of unparalleled savagery during which the whole land of the Northumbrians was ravaged and utterly laid waste. Churches were burned, monasteries sacked, and their inhabitants put to the sword regardless of age or sex. The Christian infrastructure that Edwin had carefully built over 17 years of rule was swept away in a few months of concentrated destruction. The choice of targets reveals the calculated nature of Cadwallon's campaign. churches and monasteries were particular objects of his wrath, not merely because they represented the alien faith that Edwin had imposed upon his kingdom, but because they served as symbols of Saxon cultural dominance. The destruction of these religious centers sent a clear message. The Christian civilization that the Anglo-Saxons had built could be unmade as easily as it had been created, and the British would not tolerate foreign religious or cultural hegemony over their ancient lands. Yet, Cadwallon's campaign was not merely destructive, it was also psychologically sophisticated. By demonstrating that even the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom could be humbled and devastated, the Welsh kings shattered the myth of Saxon invincibility that had sustained their expansion for 2 centuries. The Germanic settlers, who had once seen themselves as the inevitable inheritors of Roman Britain, now faced the prospect that their own conquest might prove temporary, subject to reversal by the resurgent descendants of those they had displaced. The human cost of this campaign was enormous. Thousands of Northumbrians died, not only in battle, but in the systematic massacres that followed the conquest of fortified settlements. Those who survived often found themselves homeless and destitute, their farms burned and their livestock slaughtered. The careful balance between Saxon settlers and Romano-British survivors that had characterized Northumbrian society was shattered, replaced by ethnic hatred and mutual recrimination. The religious implications of Cadwallon's campaign were equally profound. The Welsh king, despite his own Christian faith, showed no mercy to his fellow Christians among the Northumbrian population. This apparent contradiction troubled later chroniclers like Bede, who struggled to understand how a Christian ruler could wage war with such savage intensity against other Christians. The explanation lies in the complex relationship between religious and ethnic identity in 7th century Britain, where tribal loyalties often prove stronger than shared religious beliefs. For Cadwallon, Christianity was not a universal faith that transcended ethnic boundaries, but a specifically British tradition that had been corrupted and perverted by its adoption by the Saxon invaders. Edwin's conversion, from this perspective, was not a sincere embrace of the true faith, but a cynical political maneuver designed to legitimize Saxon rule over British territory. The destruction of Saxon churches was therefore not an attack on Christianity itself, but a purification of the faith from foreign contamination. This interpretation helps explain the systematic nature of the destruction visited upon Northumbrian religious sites. Cadwallon was not merely seeking to demoralize his enemies, but to reclaim sacred spaces that he believed had been wrongfully appropriated by the Saxons. The burning of churches and monasteries was thus both a military tactic and a religious statement, asserting British ownership over lands that had been British before the Saxon invasions. The winter of 633 to 634 was particularly harsh, and the combination of warfare and weather created conditions of unprecedented suffering across Northumbria. Famine followed in the wake of the Welsh armies, as stored grain was destroyed and livestock slaughtered. Disease spread rapidly among populations weakened by hunger and exposure, while the breakdown of normal social order led to banditry and internecine conflict among the survivors. Yet even in the depths of this catastrophe, the foundations of Northumbrian recovery were being laid. In the northern reaches of the kingdom, beyond the Forth, Prince Oswald gathered the scattered remnants of his people's resistance. The son of Ethelfrith, Edwin's predecessor, had spent years in exile among the Scots of Dalriada, where he had converted to the Celtic form of Christianity, practiced by the Irish monks of Iona. Now, as the last hope of his people, he prepared to stake everything on a desperate bid to reclaim his inheritance. Oswald's approach to the crisis differed fundamentally from that of his defeated predecessor, where Edwin had relied upon Roman Christianity and imperial precedent to legitimize his rule. Oswald turned to the older Celtic traditions that had sustained British resistance to Saxon expansion. His Christianity was not the continental variety favoured by Edwin, but the passionate, mystical faith of the Irish monks, a Christianity that could inspire men to die for their beliefs rather than merely submit to political convenience. The contrast between the two approaches would soon be tested in battle. Cadwallon, flushed with success and confident in his apparent divine favour, prepared to complete the destruction of Northumbrian independence. His army, enriched by a year of successful plundering, controlled most of the kingdom and seemed poised to establish permanent Welsh dominance over the northern Saxon territories. The prospect of reversing 2 centuries of Saxon expansion appeared within reach, yet the very completeness of Cadwallon's devastation may have contributed to his ultimate downfall. By destroying the infrastructure of Northumbrian society so thoroughly, he had eliminated the possibility of governing through existing institutions and local collaborators. His rule could be maintained only through continuous military occupation, requiring resources and manpower that even his successful kingdom could not indefinitely sustain. Moreover, the savagery of his campaign had united the surviving Northumbrians in a way that Edwin's more benevolent rule had never achieved. Faced with the prospect of ethnic extinction, Saxon and Romano-British survivors found common cause in resistance to Welsh domination. The artificial unity imposed by conquest was beginning to fracture, replaced by a more natural alliance based on shared suffering and common cause. The stage was thus set for the next great confrontation in the struggle for northern Britain. Cadwallon, the master of war who had humbled the greatest Anglo-Saxon kingdom, would soon face a challenge from an unexpected quarter, a prince who combined the military traditions of his Germanic ancestors with the spiritual fervour of Celtic Christianity. The collision between these two forces would determine not only the fate of Northumbria, but the future religious and political development of all Britain. In the meantime, the devastation continued through the dark months of winter, as Cadwallon's forces maintained their grip on the conquered territories. The ancient stones of Roman fortifications echoed with unfamiliar Welsh voices, while the ruins of Saxon churches smouldered in the cold northern air. The wheel of conquest had turned once again, and those who had once been conquerors now tasted the bitter fruits of defeat and displacement. As the harsh winter of 633 gave way to an uncertain spring, hope seemed all but extinguished in the war-torn landscape of Northumbria. For nearly a year, Cadwallon ap Cadfan had ruled as conqueror over the scattered remnants of what had once been the most powerful kingdom in Anglo-Saxon England. His Welsh warriors controlled the great Roman roads, his banners flew from the walls of ancient fortresses, and his systematic campaign of destruction had reduced Edwin's mighty realm to a collection of burned settlements and frightened survivors. Yet, in the wild borderlands beyond Hadrian's Wall, where Roman stones still marked the ancient frontier between civilization and barbarism, a different kind of resistance was taking shape. Prince Oswald, son of the former Northumbrian king Ethelfrith, had returned from his long exile among the Scots of Dalriada with a small but determined band of followers. Unlike the defeated Edwin, whose authority had rested upon imperial precedent and political calculation, Oswald brought with him a faith that burned with the passionate intensity of the Celtic Church. The prince's years of exile had transformed him from a dispossessed royal heir into something far more dangerous, a true believer. Among the monks of Iona, he had discovered a Christianity that was markedly different from the Roman variety that Edwin had embraced, where continental Christianity emphasized hierarchy, organization, and accommodation with secular power. Celtic Christianity celebrated spiritual intensity, personal devotion, and the mystical union between God and his chosen servants. It was a faith that could inspire men to perform miracles and Oswald would soon have need of miraculous intervention. The challenge facing the prince seemed insurmountable. Cadwallon commanded a veteran army flushed with success, controlled the wealthy heartlands of Northumbria, and could call upon reinforcements from Wales if needed. Oswald's force, by contrast, was pitifully small, little more than a warband of exiled nobles and their personal followers, supplemented by such local levies as could be hastily assembled from the devastated countryside. By any rational calculation, the coming battle should have been a massacre, with the Welsh king adding another Saxon prince to his list of victims. Yet Oswald possessed advantages that could not be measured in terms of numbers or equipment. His years among the Irish monks had taught him that victory belonged not to the strong, but to the righteous, and he was utterly convinced that God would grant triumph to those who fought in his name. This was not the calculated Christianity of political convenience that had characterized Edwin's conversion, but the burning faith of a man who had seen visions and spoken with saints. The location that Oswald chose for his desperate gamble was itself laden with symbolic significance, somewhere near the ancient Roman wall that had once marked the northernmost frontier of the empire, in a place that would later be known as Hatfield. The prince decided to make his stand. Here, where the stones of long-dead emperors still bore witness to the vanity of earthly power, the last hope of Christian Northumbria would either triumph or perish. The night before the battle, Oswald performed an act that would echo through the chronicler's accounts for centuries to come. Taking up an axe, he cut down a great tree and fashioned from it a wooden cross, which he then erected on the battlefield as a rallying point for his small army. This was not merely a religious gesture, but a revolutionary statement, a declaration that this battle would be fought not for earthly glory or political advantage, but for the honor of Christ himself. As dawn broke over the Northumbrian hills, Oswald gathered his warriors around the makeshift cross and commanded them to kneel in prayer. Here, in full view of the approaching Welsh army, the Saxon prince and his followers bent their knees not to earthly lords, but to the King of Heaven, seeking divine blessing for the desperate enterprise ahead. The sight must have been extraordinary. Hardened warriors, their armor gleaming in the morning light, humbling themselves before a roughly hewn wooden cross while their enemies prepared for slaughter. The prayer that Oswald offered in that moment, recorded by later chroniclers, revealed the depth of his faith and the magnitude of his ambition. He asked not merely for victory, but for divine vindication of his cause, pleading with God to demonstrate his power over the forces of darkness and disorder. This was Christianity not as a comfortable social convention, but as a revolutionary force capable of overturning the established order of the world. When the armies finally clashed, the battle that followed defied all expectations. Cadwallon's veteran warriors, confident in their numerical superiority and buoyed by a year of unbroken success, advanced to what they assumed would be another easy victory. Yet they found themselves facing an enemy transformed by religious fervor, men who fought not merely for their own lives, but for the honor of their God. The Welsh king himself led the assault, his war gear magnificent and his reputation terrible. Here was the conqueror of Edwin, the scourge of Northumbria, the man who had humbled the greatest Anglo-Saxon kingdom and reduced its proud nobility to beggary. His personal presence on the battlefield should have been decisive, inspiring his own followers while demoralizing his Saxon opponents. Instead, Cadwallon found himself confronting something he had never encountered before. Men who welcomed death as martyrdom and who fought with the desperate courage of those who believed their cause was blessed by heaven itself. The Welsh charge, which had shattered Edwin's army at Hatfield Chase, broke against the Saxon line like waves against unmoving rock, where earthly calculations suggested inevitable defeat. divine intervention seemed to grant miraculous strength to Oswald's warriors. The climax of the battle came when Oswald and Cadwallon met in single combat, the Prince of Northumbria facing the conqueror of his kingdom in a duel that would determine the fate of nations. The Welsh king, despite his years of success and his reputation for invincibility, found himself overmatched by an opponent who fought not for glory but for God. In a moment that stunned both armies, the mighty Cadwallon fell beneath Oswald's blade, his death cry echoing across the battlefield like thunder. With their king dead, the Welsh army disintegrated with shocking suddenness. Warriors who had seemed invincible only moments before now fled in panic, abandoning their weapons and their wounded in their haste to escape. The systematic organization that had characterized Cadwallon's campaign collapsed overnight, replaced by the chaos of a routed army seeking only survival. The conquest of Northumbria, which had seemed so secure only hours before, evaporated like morning mist. The immediate aftermath of the battle was almost as significant as the fighting itself. Oswald's first act after securing the field was to order the collection and burial of the dead, including his fallen enemies. This gesture of mercy toward those who had devastated his kingdom demonstrated the transformative power of his Christian faith and marked a sharp contrast with the cycle of revenge that had characterized warfare in post-Roman Britain. The prince's treatment of prisoners and refugees was equally revolutionary. Rather than following the established pattern of enslavement or execution, Oswald proclaimed general amnesty for all who had served under Cadwallon, offering them the opportunity to return peacefully to their homes or to enter his service as free men. This policy of reconciliation, inspired by Christian teaching about forgiveness and redemption, would become a hallmark of his subsequent reign. The religious implications of the victory were immediately apparent to all who witnessed it. Here was proof that the Christian God could indeed grant victory to his faithful servants, even against overwhelming odds. The wooden cross that Oswald had erected before the battle became an object of veneration, credited with miraculous powers and visited by pilgrims from across Britain. The site itself was transformed from a battlefield into a shrine, marking the spot where divine intervention had changed the course of history. For the broader Christian church in Britain, Oswald's victory represented a crucial turning point. The apparent triumph of paganism that had followed Edwin's defeat was revealed to be temporary, a testing of faith rather than a divine judgment against Christianity. The new king's commitment to Celtic Christianity also suggested that the future of the faith in Britain might lie not with Roman hierarchy, but with the passionate spirituality of the Irish monks. The political consequences of Hatfield were equally far-reaching. Northumbria, which had seemed destined for permanent fragmentation under Welsh rule, was suddenly reunited under a monarch whose legitimacy derived not from ancient bloodlines but from divine favour. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which had begun to assert their independence following Edwin's death, now found themselves facing a revitalised northern power, led by a king whose reputation for military prowess was enhanced by his reputation for holiness. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Oswald's victory was what it revealed about the changing nature of kingship in Christian Britain. The prince had demonstrated that royal authority could be based not merely on traditional Germanic concepts of warrior leadership, but on the Christian ideal of divinely appointed service. A king could be both a successful military commander and a servant of God, wielding earthly power in service of heavenly purposes. The transformation of Oswald himself was equally remarkable. The exiled prince, who had knelt before a wooden cross with a handful of desperate followers, had become the undisputed master of northern England, his authority acknowledged even by those who had recently served his enemies. Yet he bore his triumph with a humility that amazed contemporaries attributing his success entirely to divine grace rather than personal merit. As news of the victory spread across Britain, carried by messengers who could scarcely believe the reports they bore, the balance of power shifted once again. The age of Cadwallon was over, ended as suddenly as it had begun. The age of Oswald had dawned, bringing with it new possibilities and new challenges for the emerging Christian kingdoms of early medieval England. In the halls of Tamworth, where Penda held court among his pagan warriors, the news must have been received with mixed emotions. The Mercian king had achieved his primary objective of freeing his kingdom from Northumbrian overlordship, but he now faced a new and potentially more dangerous adversary in the victorious Oswald. The great game of 7th century politics was about to enter a new phase, with the last pagan king of England preparing to test his strength against the newest Christian champion of the north. Following his triumph at Hatfield, Oswald of Northumbria emerged as the dominant figure in 7th century British politics, his authority acknowledged from the Scottish borders to the English Channel. The young king, who had knelt in prayer before a wooden cross, now sat upon the most powerful throne in Anglo-Saxon England, his reputation for both military prowess and Christian sanctity making him a formidable opponent for any who might challenge his supremacy. Yet in the heart of England, in the timber halls of Tamworth, another king watched and waited, biding his time while carefully weighing his options. For Penda, these years following Oswald's victory represented a period of careful calculation and strategic patience. The Mercian king had achieved his immediate goal of independence from Northumbrian overlordship, but he now found himself facing a potentially more dangerous situation than the one he had escaped. Edwin's power had been based primarily on military might and political calculation. Oswald's authority rested upon the more dangerous foundation of religious fervour, combined with proven success in battle. The new Northumbrian king's approach to ruling differed dramatically from that of his predecessor, where Edwin had relied upon Roman Christianity, an imperial precedent to legitimize his authority. Oswald drew his inspiration from the passionate Celtic Christianity of the Irish monks. This was a faith that emphasized personal holiness, miraculous intervention, and the divine right of Christian kings to rule over pagan peoples. Such an ideology posed a direct challenge to rulers like Penda, who refused to abandon their ancestral beliefs. Yet Penda's response to this challenge demonstrated the political sophistication that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than launching an immediate attack against the victorious Oswald, the Mercian king chose to consolidate his own position while carefully observing his rival's actions. This period of watchful waiting allowed him to strengthen his kingdom's defenses, expand his network of allies, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation that would come when circumstances were more favorable. The religious dimension of the emerging rivalry between the two kings added layers of complexity to an already intricate political situation. Oswald's victory at Hatfield had been interpreted throughout the Christian world as divine vindication of the true faith against pagan opposition. The new king actively promoted this interpretation, presenting himself as God's chosen instrument for the conversion of heathen Britain. His court at Bamberg became a centre of missionary activity, from which Irish monks spread out across northern England to establish churches and convert the population. This evangelical fervour inevitably brought Oswald into conflict with the few remaining pagan strongholds, of which Mercia was by far the most significant. The Northumbrian king could not claim to be completing God's work in Britain, while the heartland of England remained under the rule of a pagan monarch. Conversely, Penda could not ignore the implicit threat posed by a neighbour who viewed the conquest of heathen kingdoms as a religious duty rather than merely a political opportunity. The military balance between the two kingdoms during this period remained delicately poised. Northumbria's recent victory had demonstrated the continued vitality of Anglo-Saxon warrior culture, while Mercia's central position and growing prosperity provided resources that could potentially match Northumbrian strength. Both kings were experienced commanders who understood that premature action could lead to catastrophic defeat, making the period between Hatfield and their eventual confrontation a time of careful preparation rather than open warfare. Penda used these years to systematically strengthen his position throughout central England. His victory over Edwin had demonstrated that the mighty could fall and that traditional Mercian values of courage and independence remained relevant in an age of Christian conversion. This success attracted warriors and nobles from across the pagan regions of Britain, men who saw in the Mercian court a refuge from the religious pressures that were transforming their homelands. The king's marriage alliances during this period reveal his sophisticated understanding of the political landscape. By wedding his children to partners from both Christian and pagan royal houses, Penda created a complex web of relationships that could be activated when circumstances required. These marriages were not merely diplomatic gestures, but strategic investments in future possibilities, creating options that could be exercised when the time for decisive action arrived. Meanwhile, Oswald's own policies were creating tensions that a skilled opponent could exploit. The Northumbrian king's commitment to Celtic Christianity put him at odds with the Roman Church's claims to authority over all British Christians. His support for Irish monks and their distinctive practices regarding everything from the calculation of Easter to the style of monastic tonsure created theological controversies that divided the Christian community and provided opportunities for political manipulation. Moreover, Oswald's evangelical zeal, while impressive to his Christian supporters, generated resentment among those who valued traditional Germanic customs and beliefs. The systematic destruction of pagan shrines and the forcible conversion of reluctant populations created pockets of discontent that could potentially be exploited by an enemy who represented an alternative to Christian kingship. The economic dimensions of the rivalry were equally important. Both kingdoms controlled vital trade routes and possessed the agricultural resources necessary to support large armies, but their approaches to economic development differed significantly. Oswald's Christianity opened doors to trade with continental Christian kingdoms and provided access to the learning and technology of the broader Christian world. Penda's paganism, by contrast, maintained connections with the traditional Germanic trading networks and preserved the cultural continuity that many of his subjects valued. During these years of apparent peace, both kings were also engaged in a subtle competition for influence among the smaller kingdoms that dotted the British landscape. East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and the various Welsh kingdoms found themselves courted by both Northumbria and Mercia, their allegiances shifting based on immediate interests rather than long-term loyalty. This diplomatic chess game required constant attention and considerable resources, as each side sought to build coalitions that could provide decisive advantage in the event of war. The cultural dimensions of the rivalry were perhaps the most profound of all. Oswald's court represented the future, a Christian kingdom aligned with continental European civilization and committed to the transformation of British society along religious lines. Penda's court represented the past, a Germanic warrior culture that valued traditional virtues and maintained the customs that had sustained the Anglo-Saxon peoples since their migration to Britain. Yet this was not simply a conflict between progress and reaction. Both courts were centers of learning and cultural achievement, producing poetry, metalwork, and other artistic expressions that reflected their respective values and beliefs. The question was not which culture was more sophisticated, but which would prove more attractive to the emerging Anglo-Saxon identity. The religious tolerance that Penda displayed during this period was particularly remarkable and politically astute. While maintaining his own pagan beliefs and practices, the Mercian king allowed Christian missionaries to preach within his territories and permitted his own family members to convert when political circumstances suggested such a course. This policy created space for different religious traditions to coexist and prevented him from being portrayed simply as an enemy of Christianity per se. This tolerance was not weakness but strength, reflecting Penda's confidence in his own beliefs and his understanding that religious diversity could be a source of political advantage. By accommodating Christians within his kingdom, while remaining true to his ancestral faith, he demonstrated that effective rule did not require religious uniformity, and that traditional Germanic values could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. As the years passed and both kings consolidated their positions, the sense of approaching confrontation grew stronger. Minor border incidents became more frequent, diplomatic communications grew more formal and less friendly, and both courts began the careful preparations that would be necessary when words finally gave way to swords. The great game of 7th century politics was approaching its climax, and all of Britain held its breath in anticipation of the collision between the last great pagan king and the newest Christian champion. The shadows were beginning to lengthen across the land, and in those shadows, two kings prepared for a battle that would determine not only their own fates, but the future religious and cultural development of England itself. The age of accommodation was ending, and the age of decision was about to begin. The summer of 642 dawned bright and clear across the borderlands between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms, where ancient trackways wound through forests that had witnessed the rise and fall of Roman power, and now would see the collision of two of the most formidable warrior kings of their age. In this disputed territory, where loyalties shifted like morning mist and alliances could change with the seasons, Penda of Mercia prepared to face his greatest challenge yet, a direct confrontation with Oswald of Northumbria, the Christian king whose victory at Hatfield had made him the most powerful ruler in all of Britain. The events that led to this confrontation remain shrouded in the diplomatic complexities of 7th century politics. Neither Bede nor the other chroniclers who recorded these events bothered to explain the immediate causes of the war, perhaps because the underlying tensions between the two kingdoms made conflict seem inevitable. What is clear is that by the summer of 642, both kings had concluded that their rivalry could no longer be managed through diplomacy and alliance building. The time had come for steel to render judgment on their competing claims to supremacy. Penda's decision to give battle represented a calculated gamble of enormous proportions. Oswald had proven his military prowess at Hatfield, where his much smaller army had routed the supposedly invincible Cadwallon. The Northumbrian king commanded not only a formidable military machine, but also the psychological advantage that came with divine favor, apparently confirmed through miraculous victory. To challenge such an opponent required either desperate courage or supreme confidence in one's own cause, and Penda possessed both in abundance. The Mercian king's preparation for battle revealed the sophistication of his strategic thinking and the depth of his political relationships. Rather than relying solely on his own kingdom's resources, Penda assembled a coalition that demonstrated his ability to transcend traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. When military necessity demanded, Welsh princes rode alongside Saxon warriors, pagan thens fought beside Christian nobles, and British chieftains accepted the leadership of an Anglo-Saxon king in pursuit of their common interest in humbling Northumbrian power. The location that would witness their confrontation, known to history as Maserfield, though its precise modern identification remains a matter of scholarly debate, lay in the contested borderlands where Saxon settlement met Welsh resistance. Some historians identify it with Oswestry in Shropshire, others with locations further east, but all agree that the battlefield represented symbolically appropriate ground for a conflict that would determine the balance of power across all of Britain. The armies that converged on this fateful field represented more than mere collections of warriors. They embodied fundamentally different visions of what early medieval kingship should be. Oswald's forces carried the banners of Christian Northumbria, where royal authority derived from divine appointment, and where the king served as God's lieutenant on earth. Penda's coalition fought under the ancient symbols of Germanic tradition, where kingship belonged to those who could win and hold it through personal prowess and the loyalty of proven warriors. The disparity in numbers between the two armies is difficult to establish with certainty, given the tendency of medieval chroniclers to exaggerate figures for dramatic effect. What seems clear is that Penda's coalition was substantially larger than Oswald's force, though the Northumbrian army was probably more unified in command structure and tactical doctrine. The Mercian king's advantage in numbers was offset by the challenges of coordinating diverse forces that spoke different languages and followed different tactical traditions. Yet these apparent disadvantages may have proven to be strengths when the battle was actually joined. The Welsh contingents brought expertise in light cavalry tactics and knowledge of local terrain that could prove decisive in the fluid conditions of early medieval warfare. The diverse nature of Penda's army also meant that Oswald faced multiple tactical challenges simultaneously, preventing him from concentrating his attention on any single threat. The battle itself, when it finally came, was fought with a ferocity that impressed even an age accustomed to violence. Both kings led from the front in the Germanic tradition, their personal courage serving as inspiration for their followers and as a challenge to their enemies. The clash of shield walls would have produced a din audible for miles as hundreds of warriors pressed forward in the deadly embrace of hand-to-hand combat. Oswald's death, when it came, marked one of the most significant turning points in early English history. The king, who had seemed blessed by divine favour, whose victory at Hatfield had been proclaimed throughout the Christian world as proof of God's power, fell beneath the swords of his pagan enemies in a moment that must have stunned both armies. The manner of his death, fighting desperately in the front rank, surrounded by his most loyal retainers, testified to his personal courage, even as it confirmed Penda's triumph. The immediate aftermath of Oswald's fall was as significant as the battle itself. In the Germanic tradition that still governed warfare among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the treatment of a defeated enemy's body carried profound symbolic meaning. Penda's decision to have Oswald's corpse dismembered and displayed on stakes was not mere savagery, but a deliberate religious and political statement, demonstrating that the Christian king's claims to divine protection had been proven false. This ritual desecration served multiple purposes in Penda's broader strategy. To his pagan followers, it was proof that the old gods remained stronger than the Christian deity, validating their decision to remain true to ancestral traditions. To wavering Christians, it suggested that divine favor was not guaranteed to even the most pious rulers, calling into question the fundamental assumptions of Christian kingship. To potential enemies, it served as a terrible warning of the fate that awaited those who challenged Mercian power. Yet, the symbolic significance of Oswald's death extended far beyond the immediate political situation. The fallen king's reputation for personal holiness and his dramatic end while fighting for his faith ensured that he would be remembered as a martyr rather than simply a defeated warrior. The very brutality with which his body was treated became, in Christian eyes, evidence of his sanctity rather than proof of divine abandonment. The broader consequences of Maserfield rippled across the entire Anglo-Saxon world with shocking speed. Northumbria, so recently united under Oswald's charismatic leadership, fractured almost immediately into its constituent parts of Bernicia and Deira, the careful structure of alliances and overlordships that had made the Northern Kingdom the dominant power in Britain collapsed, replaced by uncertainty and internal conflict. Other kingdoms that had acknowledged Northumbrian supremacy began to reassert their independence or seek new protectors. For Penda personally, the victory represented the culmination of his rise from subordinate vassal to the most powerful king in Anglo-Saxon England. No longer could he be dismissed as a provincial chieftain clinging to outmoded religious beliefs. He had proven himself in the ultimate test of early medieval kingship, single combat with the greatest warrior of his age, and his victory had been witnessed by warriors from across Britain. The pagan king of Mercia had become a figure to be reckoned with throughout the known world. The religious implications of the battle were equally profound and long-lasting. While later Christian chroniclers would present Maserfield as a temporary setback in Christianity's inevitable triumph, contemporary observers must have seen it as evidence that the contest between cross and hammer remained very much in doubt. Penda's victory demonstrated that pagan rulers could still challenge Christian kings successfully, calling into question the assumption that conversion to Christianity was necessary for political survival. Yet the battle also revealed the continuing importance of personal prowess and warrior virtue in determining political legitimacy. Oswald had claimed authority through Christian sanction and divine appointment, but in the end, he had been judged by the ancient Germanic standard of success in combat. Penda's victory validated the traditional view that kingship belonged to those who could win and hold it through courage and skill in battle. The aftermath of Maserfield also demonstrated Penda's political sophistication and his understanding of the broader strategic situation. Rather than attempting to conquer and hold Northumbrian territory, he withdrew his forces after securing his victory and extracting tribute from the defeated kingdom. This restraint reflected his recognition that overextension could prove as dangerous as defeat, and that consolidating his gains was more important than pursuing immediate advantage. The coalition that had won the battle was carefully managed in its dissolution, with Penda ensuring that his Welsh allies departed satisfied with their share of the spoils, while maintaining the relationships that might prove useful in future conflicts. The Mercian king had demonstrated not only his ability to assemble diverse forces for a specific objective, but also his skill in managing the aftermath of victory to preserve his options for the future. As autumn settled over the borderlands where the great battle had been fought, scavengers picked clean the bones of the fallen, while poets in distant halls began to compose the songs that would preserve the memory of this momentous confrontation. The age of Oswald was over, ended as suddenly as it had begun. The age of Penda had reached its zenith, with the last great pagan king of England established as the most formidable ruler of his time. Yet even in the hour of triumph, thoughtful observers might have wondered how long such victories could continue. The tide of Christian conversion that was sweeping across Europe showed no signs of abating, and Penda's own kingdom was not immune to the influences that were transforming the medieval world. The victory at Maserfield had bought time for the old religion and the traditional ways, but it had not resolved the fundamental tensions that would ultimately determine the future of Anglo-Saxon England. In the golden autumn that followed his stunning victory at Maserfield, Penda of Mercia stood unchallenged as the most powerful ruler in 7th century Britain. The defeat and death of Oswald had shattered Northumbrian supremacy as completely as the earlier destruction of Edwin's kingdom, leaving a political vacuum that the Mercian king was uniquely positioned to fill. Yet Penda's response to this unprecedented opportunity revealed the sophisticated political intelligence that had carried him from vassal status to supreme power across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Rather than attempting to impose direct rule over the vast territories that had fallen within his sphere of influence, Penda demonstrated a masterful understanding of the limits of early medieval governance. His kingdom lacked the administrative infrastructure necessary to absorb and govern distant provinces, while the ethnic and religious diversity of his potential subjects made unified rule both impractical and potentially counterproductive. Instead, the Mercian king chose to exercise his supremacy through a complex network of client relationships, tributary arrangements, and strategic alliances that maximized his influence while minimizing the burdens of direct administration. The fragmentation of Northumbria following Oswald's death provided Penda with his first opportunity to demonstrate this new approach to overlordship. Rather than attempting to conquer and hold the northern kingdom's territories, he encouraged and exploited the division between Bernicia and Deira, ensuring that neither successor state would possess the unified strength to challenge Mercian dominance. This policy of divide and rule allowed him to extract tribute and political submission from both kingdoms while avoiding the costs and risks associated with permanent occupation. In Bernicia, Oswald's brother Oswiu struggled to maintain control over the northern territories, his authority weakened by the catastrophic defeat at Maserfield and the loss of the southern provinces to his rival in Deira. Penda's periodic raids into Bernician territory served both to extract wealth and to remind Oswiu of his subordinate status, while carefully avoiding the kind of systematic conquest that might unite the northern kingdom's nobility in desperate resistance. The situation in Deira was more complex, as Penda had to balance his desire for control against the practical necessities of finding reliable local partners. The installation of Oswine as king represented a compromise that satisfied immediate needs while preserving future options. Oswine's legitimacy derived partly from his royal bloodline and partly from Mercian support, creating a dependent relationship that served Penda's interests while providing the Deiran nobility with an acceptable alternative to direct foreign rule. East Anglia presented different challenges and opportunities. The kingdom's royal line, the Waffingers, had been devastated by earlier conflicts, leaving a succession crisis that Penda could exploit to his advantage. His intervention in East Anglian affairs was characteristically subtle, supporting rival claimants and manipulating succession disputes rather than imposing solutions through naked force. This approach allowed him to influence events while maintaining the fiction of East Anglian independence. The systematic campaign that Penda launched against the East Anglian kings during this period demonstrated both his military prowess and his strategic patience. The defeats of Egric and Sigibert were not random acts of aggression, but carefully calculated moves designed to eliminate potential threats while installing more compliant rulers. The fact that these victories were achieved against Christian kings also reinforced Penda's reputation as the champion of traditional Germanic values against foreign religious influence. Wessex, the great southern kingdom that would eventually unite all of England under its rule, found itself increasingly isolated as Penda's influence expanded. The marriage alliance between Penda's sister and Cadwallon of Wessex represented an attempt to manage this potential threat through diplomacy rather than warfare. When Cenwal's repudiation of his Mercian wife threatened this arrangement, Penda's swift military response demonstrated that even distant kingdoms could not afford to ignore Mercian interests. The 3 years during which Cadwallon lived in exile provided a fascinating example of Penda's sophisticated approach to international relations. Rather than attempting to rule Wessex directly, the Mercian king allowed the kingdom to function under regents and lesser nobles, while maintaining the threat of intervention if his interests were challenged. This arrangement preserved the kingdom's internal stability, while ensuring its neutrality in broader conflicts. The restoration of Cadwallon to his throne, after his conversion to Christianity, illustrated Penda's pragmatic approach to religious differences. Despite his own unwavering commitment to paganism, the Mercian king was willing to work with Christian rulers when political circumstances made such cooperation advantageous. This flexibility distinguished him from more rigid rulers who allowed religious prejudice to override political calculation. The smaller kingdoms and tribal groups that dotted the landscape of 7th century Britain found themselves drawn into Penda's orbit through a combination of military pressure and attractive incentives. The king's reputation for generosity in distributing treasure and weapons made service in his war bands attractive to ambitious young warriors, while his tolerance of diverse religious practices ensured that potential allies were not alienated by demands for conversion. The complex political structure that emerged under Penda's hegemony resembled in some ways the client systems that had characterized the later Roman Empire, with the crucial difference that it was held together by personal relationships rather than bureaucratic administration. The Mercian king's ability to maintain loyalty and extract tribute from such a diverse collection of subjects testified to his extraordinary personal qualities and his deep understanding of the forces that motivated early medieval rulers. The military innovations that Penda introduced during this period reflected his practical approach to the challenges of governing an expanded kingdom. Rather than relying solely on traditional Germanic infantry tactics, he experimented with combined arms approaches that incorporated cavalry units, siege engines, and specialized troops drawn from different regions of his empire. This tactical flexibility gave his armies advantages against opponents who continued to rely on more conventional methods. The economic foundations of Penda's supremacy were equally impressive. The tribute extracted from subject kingdoms provided resources that could be redistributed to maintain loyalty among his own nobles, while the security that his protection provided encouraged trade and economic development throughout his territories. The king's control of major river systems and trade routes allowed him to tax commerce while providing valuable services to merchants and craftsmen. Cultural developments under Penda's rule revealed the continuing vitality of Germanic traditions, even as Christianity gained ground elsewhere. The royal court at Tamworth became a center of pagan learning and artistic achievement, attracting poets, craftsmen, and scholars who valued the traditional values that the king embodied. The synthesis of different cultural traditions within Penda's domains created a distinctive Mercian identity that combined Anglo-Saxon heritage with innovations drawn from British and continental sources. The king's approach to succession planning during this period demonstrated his concern for the long-term stability of his achievements. The careful education of his sons and the strategic placement of family members in key positions throughout his territories ensured that Mercian interests would be protected, even if something happened to Penda himself. The marriages arranged for his children served both diplomatic and dynastic purposes, creating networks of relationship that would outlast any individual ruler. Yet for all his success in building and maintaining this complex political structure, Penda remained fundamentally a warrior king whose authority rested upon his reputation for military prowess and personal courage. The periodic campaigns that he launched against neighboring kingdoms served not only strategic purposes, but also symbolic ones, demonstrating to friend and foe alike that the Mercian king remained as formidable as ever. The religious dimension of Penda's supremacy remained a source of both strength and potential weakness. His unwavering commitment to paganism continued to attract supporters who saw him as the defender of traditional values, but it also limited his diplomatic options and provided enemies with a powerful rallying cry. The growing influence of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxon nobility created pressures that even the most successful pagan king could not ignore indefinitely. As the decade of the 640s drew to a close, Penda could survey an empire that stretched from the Welsh borders to the North Sea, encompassing most of what would later become England. His achievements represented the culmination of the traditional Germanic approach to kingship, demonstrating that the old values and customs could still produce effective rule in a rapidly changing world. Yet even at the height of his power, the forces that would ultimately bring down his pagan kingdom were already gathering strength, waiting for the moment when the last great heathen king would finally meet his match. By the dawn of the 650s, Penda Mercia stood as the last great bastion of paganism in an increasingly Christian Britain, a kingdom where the ancient gods still received their due sacrifices, and where the traditional values of the Germanic peoples continued to flourish. Yet even within this stronghold of the old faith, the gentle but persistent tide of Christian conversion was beginning to make itself felt, creating tensions and opportunities that would test the Mercian king's political skills to their utmost limits. The challenge that Christianity posed to Penda's rule was unlike any military threat he had previously faced. Where enemies on the battlefield could be met with sword and shield, the new faith advanced through quiet conversations in royal halls, through marriages that crossed religious boundaries, and through the simple human desire for salvation and eternal peace. It was a war fought not with armies, but with ideas, not with weapons, but with words, and it demanded from Penda an entirely different kind of strategic thinking. The catalyst for this religious transformation within Mercia itself came through the most personal of channels, the marriage of Penda's own son, Peada, to Alchflaed, daughter of Oswald of Northumbria. This union, arranged as part of the complex diplomatic maneuvering that followed Oswald's death, represented a masterpiece of political calculation on both sides. For Penda, it offered the possibility of neutralizing Northumbrian hostility while gaining influence over his former enemies. For Oswald, it provided an opportunity to introduce Christianity into the heart of the pagan kingdom through the most intimate of family connections. The negotiations surrounding this marriage revealed the sophistication of 7th century diplomacy and the careful balance that had to be maintained between religious conviction and political necessity. Oswald's insistence that Peada convert to Christianity before the marriage could proceed represented more than mere religious prejudice. It was a strategic attempt to create a Christian presence within the Mercian royal family that could serve as a foundation for broader missionary activity. Penda's response to this demand demonstrated the remarkable flexibility that had characterized his entire approach to religious matters. Rather than rejecting the marriage proposal outright, or forcing his son to refuse conversion, the Mercian king chose to allow Peada to make his own decision in the matter. This apparent tolerance masked a sophisticated political calculation. By permitting his son's conversion, Penda could maintain the alliance with Northumbria, while demonstrating that Christianity posed no threat to those who chose to embrace it. The conversion ceremony itself, conducted by Bishop Finan of Lindisfarne, in the presence of both royal courts, marked a historic moment in the religious development of Anglo-Saxon England. Here was the son and heir of the greatest pagan king openly accepting baptism and professing faith in Christ, apparently with his father's blessing. The symbolic implications were enormous, suggesting that even the most committed defenders of the old religion might be willing to accommodate the new faith when circumstances required. Yet Penda's private feelings about his son's conversion remain hidden behind the diplomatic language of the chronicles. As a father, he may have felt genuine anguish at seeing his heir abandon the faith of their ancestors. As a king, he surely understood the political advantages that Peada's Christianity might provide, As a man who had spent his entire life defending the old ways, he must have wondered whether this concession represented wisdom or weakness. The immediate consequences of Peada's conversion extended far beyond the personal and familial sphere. As the newly baptized prince returned to his father's kingdom, he brought with him not only a Christian wife, but also a small group of missionary priests whose presence had been negotiated as part of the marriage agreement. These men, led by the experienced missionary Diuma, were granted permission to preach throughout the territories under Peada's direct control, marking the beginning of organized Christian missionary activity within Mercia itself. The king's decision to permit this missionary activity represented one of the most remarkable aspects of his entire reign. Here was a ruler who had built his reputation on defending pagan traditions against Christian encroachment, yet he was willing to allow foreign priests to preach an alien faith within his own territories. This apparent contradiction can only be understood in the context of Penda's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political power and religious belief. By allowing Christian preaching while maintaining his own pagan practices, Penda demonstrated that effective rule did not require religious uniformity. His subjects were free to choose their own spiritual path, whether that led to the ancient groves where their ancestors had worshipped, or to the new churches where Christ was praised. This policy of religious tolerance was extraordinary for its time and reflected a confidence in his own authority that few rulers of the period could match. The missionaries who entered Mercia during this period found a population that was far from uniformly hostile to their message. Years of contact with Christian kingdoms had familiarized many Mercians with the basic tenets of the new faith, while the practical advantages of conversion, access to literacy, connections with powerful Christian rulers, participation in the broader European cultural community, made Christianity attractive to ambitious nobles and merchants. Yet the missionaries also encountered significant resistance from those who remained committed to the traditional religion. The pagan priests and nobles who had supported Penda's rise to power viewed Christian conversion as a betrayal of everything that had made Mercia great. Their opposition was not merely theological, but cultural and political, reflecting a deep-seated fear that adoption of the new faith would inevitably lead to the abandonment of the warrior values and tribal loyalties that defined their identity. Penda's own position in this religious transformation was complex and often contradictory. While he permitted and even protected Christian missionaries, he continued to practice the ancestral religion with unwavering devotion. His participation in pagan ceremonies and his consultation of traditional priests demonstrated that his tolerance of Christianity did not extend to personal conversion. The king remained, in his own mind and in the eyes of his most loyal followers, the champion of the old gods and the defender of ancient traditions. This religious dualism created fascinating dynamics within the Mercian court and throughout the kingdom. Christian and pagan nobles served side by side in the royal warband, their different faiths apparently causing few practical difficulties in their common service to the king. Intermarriage between Christian and pagan families became increasingly common, creating household situations where multiple religious traditions coexisted and often blended in unexpected ways. The theological implications of this religious mixing were profound and troubling to more rigid adherents of both faiths. Christian missionaries worried that their converts might retain pagan practices alongside their new beliefs, creating a syncretic religion that satisfied neither God nor the ancient gods. Pagan priests feared that their followers might gradually abandon traditional practices in favor of Christian alternatives, leading to the slow death of their ancestral faith. Yet for Penda and many of his subjects, this religious flexibility represented strength rather than weakness. The ability to draw upon multiple spiritual traditions provided resources for dealing with the various challenges that life presented, while the tolerance of diverse beliefs created space for negotiation and compromise that might otherwise have been impossible. The king's court became a unique environment where different religious traditions could encounter each other on terms of mutual respect, rather than bitter hostility. The broader political implications of Mercia's religious evolution were equally significant. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which had often viewed Penda's paganism as evidence of his fundamental otherness, now found themselves dealing with a ruler whose kingdom was increasingly similar to their own in its religious composition. This similarity created new possibilities for diplomacy and alliance, while reducing the ideological barriers that had previously separated Mercia from its neighbours. The missionary success within Mercia also had important consequences for the broader Christian church in Britain. The conversion of significant numbers of Mercians provided the church with a substantial population of new adherents and created opportunities for further expansion into the still pagan regions of Britain. The establishment of Christian institutions within Mercia itself provided bases from which missionaries could launch expeditions into neighbouring territories. Yet the most significant aspect of this religious transformation may have been what it revealed about Penda himself. The king, who had built his reputation on defending pagan traditions, proved capable of adapting to changing circumstances without abandoning his core principles. His tolerance of Christian conversion among his subjects, including his own family members, demonstrated a political sophistication and personal security that impressed even his enemies. As the 600s progressed and Christian influence within Mercia continued to grow, Penda found himself ruling over a kingdom that was increasingly different from the purely pagan realm he had inherited. Yet he had managed this transformation in such a way that his own authority remained undiminished and his personal convictions unchanged. The last great pagan king of Anglo-Saxon England had demonstrated that even the most fundamental changes could be accommodated without sacrificing the essential character that made effective leadership possible. The stage was thus set for the final act of Penda's remarkable reign. The religious accommodation that he had achieved within his own kingdom would soon be tested by the ultimate challenge, a renewed confrontation with Northumbrian power that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of paganism in Britain. The tides of faith were still rising, and even the most skillful navigator would soon discover whether his vessel could survive the approaching storm. The winter of 654 settled over Britain like a shroud, bringing with it an ominous sense that the old order was approaching its end. In the halls of Tamworth, where the firelight flickered against ancient timber walls, decorated with the weapons and banners of countless victories, Penda of Mercia contemplated what would prove to be the most momentous decision of his long and remarkable reign. The aging king, now approaching 50 years of age and bearing the accumulated scars of 3 decades of warfare, faced a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of paganism in Anglo-Saxon England. The immediate cause of the crisis lay in the north, where Oswald of Northumbria had gradually rebuilt his kingdom's strength in the years following his brother Oswald's death at Maserfield. The Bernician king had proven himself a more subtle and patient adversary than his predecessors, working through diplomacy and intrigue rather than direct confrontation to expand his influence throughout Britain. His success in converting Peada and establishing a Christian presence within Mercia itself represented a strategic victory that potentially outweighed any military defeat. Yet the threat that Oswald posed extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. The Northumbrian king's commitment to Christianity was every bit as fervent as Penda's devotion to the old gods, and he viewed the continued existence of a powerful pagan kingdom as both a theological scandal and a political challenge that could not be indefinitely tolerated. The marriage alliance between their children had bought time, but it hadn't resolved the fundamental contradictions that made lasting peace between the two kingdoms impossible. The diplomatic crisis that would trigger the final confrontation arose from the complex web of relationships that characterized 7th century British politics. The death of Anna of East Anglia in 654, killed during one of Penda's campaigns to maintain Mercian influence over the Eastern Kingdom, had removed a crucial buffer between the two great powers. Anna's successor, his brother Ethelhere, found himself caught between competing pressures from north and south, his kingdom's survival dependent upon choosing the correct side in the approaching conflict. For Penda, the situation represented both unprecedented danger and extraordinary opportunity. On one hand, the growing Christian influence within his own kingdom and the broader momentum of conversion throughout Britain suggested that time was working against the pagan cause. Each passing year brought new pressures for religious conformity and reduced the number of potential allies who might be willing to stand with the last great heathen king against Christian opposition. On the other hand, the very success of Christian expansion had created resentments and tensions that a skilled politician might be able to exploit. Not every conversion had been voluntary, and not every Christian kingdom was satisfied with its position in the emerging religious order. The possibility existed for assembling a coalition that could challenge Northumbrian supremacy once and for all, potentially reversing the tide of Christian expansion and preserving space for the old religion to survive and flourish. The decision to launch what would become his final campaign represented the culmination of Penda's political philosophy and military strategy. Throughout his reign, he had demonstrated time and again that aggressive action could achieve objectives that seemed impossible through defensive measures alone. His victories over Edwin and Oswald had been won by seizing the initiative at moments when his enemies believed themselves secure, and the same approach might yet succeed against Oswald. The coalition that Penda assembled for this climactic campaign was perhaps the most impressive military alliance in 7th century British history. At its core stood the traditional Mercian warbands, veterans of countless battles who had followed their king through 3 decades of conquest and triumph. Around this nucleus gathered forces from across the breadth of Britain, Welsh princes still smarting from earlier defeats, East Anglian nobles seeking to escape Northumbrian domination, Saxon thanes who valued the old ways above the new religion. The most significant addition to this alliance was Ethelhere of East Anglia, whose decision to support Penda rather than submit to Oswald represented a crucial strategic victory for the Mercian cause. Ethelhere's participation brought not only military forces, but also legitimacy to Penda's campaign, demonstrating that even Christian kings might prefer pagan overlordship to Northumbrian hegemony. The East Anglian king's presence in the coalition suggested that the conflict would be political, rather than purely religious in nature. Perhaps most remarkably, the alliance even included Ethelwald of Deira, son of the great Oswald himself. This prince's decision to support his father's killer against his own uncle revealed the complex family dynamics and political calculations that characterized Anglo-Saxon royal politics. For Ethelwald, the choice may have been between accepting permanent subordination to Oswald or gambling on Penda's promise of independence and enhanced status within a new political order. The campaign itself began in the summer of 655 with a massive invasion of Northumbrian territory that demonstrated the full extent of Penda's military resources. The Allied army was reportedly composed of 30 separate contingents, each led by a king or prince and representing a different region or tribal group. This great host advanced northward along the old Roman roads, its progress marked by the systematic destruction of Northumbrian settlements and the collection of tribute from terrified populations. The sheer scale of the invasion forced its way deep into Northumbrian territory, far beyond the traditional battlegrounds where previous conflicts had been decided. Oswald found himself besieged at a northern stronghold, possibly Stirling or another fortress beyond the Forth, while Penda's army controlled the roads and ravaged the countryside at will. For a time, it seemed that the Mercian king's gamble would achieve complete success, with Northumbria facing the same kind of systematic destruction that Cadwallon had once inflicted upon Edwin's kingdom. Yet the very completeness of Penda's initial success may have contributed to his ultimate downfall. The vast distance from Mercia to the siege site stretched supply lines to their breaking point, while the diverse nature of the coalition army made unified command increasingly difficult as the campaign progressed. Different contingents had different objectives and different levels of commitment to the common cause, creating tensions that a skilled enemy might be able to exploit. Oswald's response to the crisis demonstrated the political sophistication that had enabled him to rebuild Northumbrian power after his brother's death. Rather than attempting to match Penda's army in open battle, the Northumbrian king chose to offer tribute and seek negotiations, apparently acknowledging defeat while secretly preparing for a more favorable opportunity. This apparent submission satisfied some of Penda's allies, while giving Oswald time to assess the situation and plan his response. The distribution of Northumbrian treasure among Penda's British allies may have been intended as a gesture of magnanimity, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of the coalition. By accepting tribute, the Welsh princes and other supporters demonstrated that their primary interest lay in immediate gain rather than long-term strategic objectives. Their commitment to the campaign was contingent upon continued success and profitable outcomes, making them unreliable partners when circumstances changed. The decision to withdraw from the siege and begin the long journey home represented the turning point of the entire campaign. Whether this retreat was motivated by practical considerations, the approach of winter, supply difficulties, or problems with coalition unity, or by strategic calculation remains unclear. What is certain is that it provided Oswald with the opportunity he needed to transform defeat into victory through a combination of military action and political manipulation. The Northumbrian king's decision to pursue and attack the withdrawing army demonstrated both courage and tactical brilliance. By waiting until Penda's forces were strung out along the march route and potentially demoralized by apparent failure, Oswald maximized his chances of success while minimizing the risks associated with confronting a superior enemy. The choice of battlefield, near a river swollen by autumn rains, provided additional advantages that would prove decisive in the coming fight. The defection of key allies at the crucial moment revealed the fragility of the coalition that Penda had assembled. Cadwallon of Gwynedd's flight under cover of darkness, earning him the contemptuous nickname Battle Shirker, deprived the army of significant military strength, while undermining morale throughout the remaining forces. Ethelwald of Dara's withdrawal to a position of safety demonstrated that even family connections could not guarantee loyalty when survival was at stake. Mercia ascendant. The coalition that had won the battle was carefully managed in its dissolution, with Penda ensuring that his Welsh allies departed satisfied with their share of the spoils, while maintaining the relationships that would be needed for whatever storms might gather on the horizon. In the soft light of late summer, the Mercian king returned to Tamworth not as a challenger, but as the unchallenged master of central Britain. In hall and hearth, the old songs took on new luster, and gifts of arm rings and inlaid blades glittered in the fire glow as loyalty was bound with oaths and generosity. For several quiet winters, quiet only in comparison to the thunder that had gone before. The power of Mercia settled like dew over the Midlands. This was not an empire of written edicts and carved stone, but of word kept and treasure shared, of hostages treated fairly and oaths enforced without malice. Penda's rule, for all its steel, had a paradoxical gentleness to it. He punished treachery without cruelty and rewarded courage without extravagance. A man could know where he stood with such a king, and in uncertain times that certainty was coin beyond price. Trade renewed itself along the river roads. Carts creaked over the Trent's fords with salt and wool, garnets and glass. Smiths in their smoky sheds hammered out sword edges fine as frost, and weavers dyed cloth in the colours of dawn. The halls of Mercia were not only mustering grounds, they were marketplaces of story and craft, where Christian monks and pagan poets might share the same bench, arguing softly about providence and word, as a harp murmured beneath their words. Penda allowed this mingling not from indifference, but from confidence. The old gods were not brittle in his keeping. They were supple, capable of hosting guests. East Anglia's winter, yet the wheel of fortune turns, and a king's quiet years are only pauses between marches. In the frost-silver dawns of the early 650s, Penda's banners were seen again upon the eastern roads, riding toward the fenlands of East Anglia. There, kings had risen and fallen with a swiftness that troubled the sleep of abbots and ealdormen alike. Rumour, that most tireless of travellers, carried news of sanctity and swords in equal measure, monasteries whose bells rang through the mist, and courts where spears leaned in clusters against painted walls. The clash, when it came, was quick and cruel as winter. Anna of East Anglia, a king praised for piety, and for a house that seemed blessed with saints, found his realm tested by the pagan warlord from the Midlands. It was not religion that drew Penda eastward, though later pens would try to make it so. It was the stern arithmetic of power, tribute, and the need to chastise a neighbour who leaned too readily upon Northumbrian favour. At a place remembered as Bull Camp by some, near the whispering reeds and cold waters, East Anglia's host broke. Anna fell, and with him a season of gentle peace in the marsh kingdom. The sound of weeping rose from cloister and cottage. And yet, mark this, dear sleeper, no decree followed commanding the destruction of churches. Penda's victory, like his belief, was flint-hard but tightly bounded. From the east he returned, as he had so often done, not as a conqueror planting foreign officers, but as an overlord reminding lesser kings where the centre of the wheel lay. Tribute was agreed, oaths renewed, hostages exchanged with the solemnity of a marriage. And then Mercia's roads were quiet again, as if the land itself exhaled. Piada and the cross. In those calmer months, another thread began to wind itself into the fabric of Mercia's story. One spun not from iron, but from water and blessing. Piada, Penda's son, handsome and hot-hearted as young princes often are, journeyed north to the court of Oswald of Bernicia, the brother of the fallen Oswald, a ruler cautious as a cat in frost and sharp as a new-made knife. There he looked upon Oswald's daughter, Alfled by name in some tellings, Alfled in others, and love did its ancient, unstoppable work. The prince desired a marriage that could bind wounds older than he. The northern court offered agreement with a condition: baptism and instruction at the hands of Christian teachers. It would have been easy for a father king to reply with fury. Yet Penda, stern Penda, who would not bend his own knee to any new altar, did not rage. The old king's creed had space for conscience. Let him come home better, if better he becomes, one can imagine him saying, in the measured tone with which he ordered armies and mediated feuds. Only let him be a good man, a brave man, and a generous man. A craven in any faith is unfit to sit in a high seat, And so Peada received the sign of the cross and brought with him priests to the valleys of the Tame. They built in wood, as all Britain built then, and sang their psalms in the same air where poets had chanted the names of Woden's line. No smoke rose from burned churches, no groves were felled by royal command. Penda of Mercia was a strange, liminal place, pagan and patient, where a son could preach Christ and a father could offer to Woden, and both could sit, for a time, at the same board. The net tightens, but far in the north, beneath the basalt crags and sea-misted headlands, Oswald measured the years and counted the spears. He could not forget Maserfield. The memory was a coal he turned in his palm, blackening his fingers. Northumbria's two halves, Bernicia and Dara, were loosely laced together, and within that lacing threads frayed. Ethelwald of Dara eyed his northern cousin with the restlessness of a young hawk. Welsh princes watched the Pennine passes. East Anglian nobles weighed tribute against defiance. All knew that if ever there was to be a reckoning with Mercia, it must come with a blaze of sudden decision, not the slow erosion of border raids. Penda, it was said, could call to his banner 30 sub-kings and princes, a storyteller's number perhaps, but not far from the truth of his breadth of alliances. Britons from Powys and Pengwern, Saxon lords from Lindsey and Whitchy, men of Magonsade and Middle Anglia, each bound by gifts, by marriages, by the iron ring of victory shared. The great storm gathered by degrees, like cloud banks stacking over autumn hills. Negotiations flickered like foxfire. Oswald offered gold and wrought plates, perhaps even hostages from his own house, if the pagan king would be content to stand down. Penda, whether from confidence or from the iron pride that had carried him so far, refused to be bought, and so, late in the year of 655, when the rivers ran full with rain and every ford was treacherous with brown, hurrying water, the armies moved. Winwaed rising. The place remembered as the Winwaed is a shadow on the map, even for those who know the country. Some point toward the watery meadows near modern Leeds, others to tributaries whose names have changed. No matter. The essential truth for our gentle tale is simple. A valley, rain-beaten and slick, a river beyond its banks, and two great hosts drawing breath for the shout. Penda's army was the larger, vast enough to turn a hillside dark, vast enough that the rumble of their going shook wattle walls in villages miles away. Standards lifted like winter branches against a paling sun. The allies took their places, Cadwallon of Powys among the Britons, Ethelwald of Dara leading the southern Northumbrians nominally on Mercia's side, banners from the east, from the west, from the edge of Wales. Oswald's host was smaller, taut as a bowstring drawn to the ear. Night fell with the awkward early darkness of late autumn. Rain stitched the fields, fires crackled damply. In both camps, men prayed in their different ways, some to the White Christ, some to the one-eyed God, and some, weary and honest, only for a dry cloak and the sight of morning. Stories say Oswald offered again rich gifts, bowls of worked metal and arm rings heavy as apples. Stories say Penda would not take them. The truth behind stories is often a braid of both. At dawn, the river spoke. It had grown in the night to a living thing, a long brown serpent rushing and hissing, its banks crumbling in great sodden bites. Horns sounded. Shield met shield. The two lines kissed with iron and would not come apart. Then, in the churn of combat, the fabric of Penda's coalition tore. Ethelwald of Dara, who had dreamed of advantage in Mercian triumph, slipped away, leaving a gap where certainty should have been. Cadwallon of Powys, so some Welsh singers claim, departed with his men in a moment remembered as Cadwallon's flight. Perhaps prudence spoke to him. Perhaps the river's voice was louder than the horns. However it was, The line that had looked like a cliff face became a slope, and in war, a slope becomes a slide. Oswald drove in. The smaller host moved with the unity that comes to men who have nothing to spare and therefore waste nothing. Riders found the softest edges. Spearmen locked their knees and pushed. Axemen swung where shields opened like eyelids. And always the river gathered the fallen, friend and foe together, drawing them down into its brown throat. By afternoon, the banners of Mercia were clotted with mud. The shouts lost their rhythm and took on that higher, thinner note that comes when order begins to fray. Penda, old now, but still iron, fought where the fight was thickest, trying to knit the rent with his own presence as a needle draws thread. He had done it before. He had snatched victory from worse tangles. But rain and treachery, flood and fatigue are armies of their own. When the end came, it came as ends often do in such tales. Suddenly, and everywhere at once, a surge along the bank, a standard dipping and not rising, a king surrounded not by the men he chose, but by the moment he could not refuse. The last light of Penda, there are versions of the story that linger, as stories love to do, upon the manner of his death, whether by spear or sword, on bank or in shallows, whether his last word was a curse or a prayer. We need not choose among them tonight. It is enough to know that Penda, son of Pibba, king of Mercia, the last great pagan ruler of the English, fell beside a river swollen with the year's grief. The men who had followed him laid down their spears, or fled, or were taken in mercy by the same waters that had taken their foes. On the far bank, Oswald offered thanks in the Christian manner. He had wagered everything against a storm and found himself, at last, in cold sunlight. The field was his, and with it the strange duty that victory lays upon the living, to put order where chaos had spent itself, to repair what can be repaired, and to remember what must not be forgotten. Aftermath and ashes news travels quickly when it is heavy, south through the shires and over the Wrekin, through the Wyche, and along the Severn's winding course. The word went out, Penda is fallen. Mercia trembled, not collapsed, but trembled as a great beast trembles after a wound. Oswald's power poured into the vacuum with the efficiency of water seeking a hollow. For a while, years counted softly, not many. Northumbria held Mercia, as a man holds a hawk, half with glove and half with gaze. Piada, the baptized son, was set as under king in the south near the old Roman roads by agreement and design. In the north, Oswald's own writ ran, but Mercia is a land with a long memory and deep roots. What is held by pressure alone cannot be held indefinitely. In due course, some say within a year, some within 2. Piada died strangely at Eastertide, a tale veiled in accusations that historians repeat and then fold away like garments too fine for daily use. Into the space left by grief and governance stepped Wulfhere, another of Penda's sons, young and fierce, and, like green wood, quick to take flame. Under him Mercia rose again, no longer pagan in every hall, but Mercian still in every field, stubborn, generous, iron-sinewed. What remained? And what of Penda's memory, dear listener drowsing on the edge of dream? Time is a maker of saints and villains, and the pens that scratched the vellum of later centuries were mostly held by men who prayed to the White Christ. They made Oswald a saint, as perhaps he was, and Oswald a king in God's good order. Of Penda they wrote with a careful hand. A pagan, yes, a scourge of Christians sometimes, yet also a man who did not force belief upon the unwilling, who allowed preaching in his lands, who esteemed courage wherever he found it. Even his enemies, when they set down their inkhorns, admitted what his warriors had known. He was a king cut to the old pattern, unbending and unexpectedly fair. In the imagination of Mercia, he became something older than a chronicle entry. a figure you glimpse between trees at dusk, a rhythm in the hammer stroke of a smith, a steadiness in the gaze of a reeve settling a boundary dispute. In the telling of grandmothers near winter hearths, he was the king who kept covenant with his people more surely than with any foreign altar. In the murmurs of monks editing their texts, he was the necessary shadow that made their saints' halos shine. The quiet lesson, if there is a lesson to carry with you into sleep, gentle and unhurried, like the way a river bends around a stone, it may be this: that power, to be worth the having, must be rooted in something deeper than fashion and louder than boast. Penda's root was old as oak, loyalty kept, valor proved, generosity shown without counting the cost too closely. He could not stop the tide that would turn Britain Christian, nor did he try to drown it with cruelty. He simply stood where he stood, and in standing gave his people years of order in a disorderly age. And when at last he fell, the lands he had ruled did not become desert. They changed, as all lands change, and yet they remained themselves. Fields were ploughed, children were named, songs were sung in old modes and new. The gods of his fathers were bowed from their high seats, but the virtues he cherished, courage, fidelity, largeness of spirit, walked forward into the Christian centuries wearing different clothes. Sleepy, crown farewell. So now let the rain on the Winwaed soften to a distant hush, and the clatter of shields at Maserfield fade into the far-off percussion of a summer storm you need not rise to meet. Let Tamworth's hall lights gutter one by one, until only a single lamp burns in the doorway, and then that too goes out. Breathe in, and think of the Trent in autumn, broad, unhurried, gathering tributaries of story and dream. Breathe out, and let your thoughts of kings and banners slip down river, to the place where all histories empty into a sea too wide for waking eyes. You are safe here, among friends, among listeners who love the old tales not for their rancour, but for their rhythm. If, when morning comes, you remember the steady figure of a king who would not bend his knee, but would hear a priest's song without anger, if you recall a son returning home with new beliefs and still finding a father's welcome, if you carry the feel of wet earth under the feet of two great armies and the sound of a river swollen with fate, then Penda has not passed entirely from the world. He keeps a kind of vigil in the memory of those who rest well. Good night, dear dreamer. May your sleep be deep and your waking gentle, and may the old stories, told softly, be a bridge across the waters of the night. Sleepy crown,